Greetings. Amidst this disorienting COVID-19 pandemic, it is heartening to be able to participate in the fabulous conference organized by Tracy Adams, Christy Carpenter, and their team in New Zealand, which David K. Smith and his équipe at H. France Salon have rescued. All of them have done tremendous work. I offer them my deep thanks and praise. Félicitations. Mark Bloch famously wrote in The Historian's Craft that knowing the present can help elucidate the past, and conversely, the past, the present. In this season of contagion, I am going to seize on our COVID-19 induced obsession with rates of infection and death to help us better understand the phenomenon of the growth of the evangelical movement in early 16th century France. The linkage is not contrived. French authorities frequently likened the new Protestant doctrines to the plague, which, as we know, in those years regularly struck without warning to devastating effect. When the doctors of the Faculty of Theology of Paris condemned Luther in 1521, they warned that if the menace of heresy was not stopped from spreading, and its chief fomenters were not silenced, then not just the religion, but the kingdom would fall. As it turned out, despite the regime of repression church and state orchestrated from 1521 to 61, the movement did spread. Eventually, starting in 1555, evangelicals began establishing Reformed churches underground. As I have demonstrated statistically elsewhere, these clandestine congregations were small and few in number until 1559. Then, in the political turmoil following Henry II's death, a broad Huguenot movement sprang up, gaining something like 80% of its adherents. This shocking spike in the contagion of heresy precipitated the wars that would tear France apart for the next 36 years. The title of this paper echoes Robert Kingdon's seminal work of 1956, Geneva and the Coming of the Wars of Religion in France. In it, he examined 86 missionary pastors sent from Geneva who ministered to French Reformed churches, advised sympathetic nobles, and helped to organize the Huguenot movement from 1555 to the outbreak of the war. My recasting of Kingdon's title broadcasts the major historiographical claim I am making. All scholars to date, from Imbach de la Tour through Kingdon, Mark Greengrass, Philip Benedict, and Denis Crouzet, have realized that the groundwork for the rise of the Huguenot movement was prepared long before. Scholars, however, only advance educated conjectures about the ways Protestant ideas infiltrated France via workshops, schools and universities, noble affinity networks, the activities of dissident clerics, and the circulation of Protestant books. As all scholars note, the stumbling block to understanding the social geography and chronology of the spread of heterodox doctrines is that persecution forced dissidents to hide, leaving only fragmentary traces of their activities, which lie scattered in disparate sources. My contention is that we can use the very records of heresy repression to demonstrate statistically, with a high degree of confidence, that well over 1,000 clerics operating within the established church in France, some of them for decades, were the chief agents, the super spreaders, if you will, who inculcated evangelical doctrines among the French people. Making that statistical demonstration, which to my knowledge no one has attempted before, and explaining the significance of this finding is the goal of this short paper. Though the statistical number crunching may be a bit dry, the results are vitally important, for if they hold up, they undergird two other major claims, which I will briefly illustrate by way of conclusion. Namely that for the early 1520s onward, such heterodox clerics succeeded via their public preaching and private teaching in forming parachurch groups called conventicles in the sources, which had a distinctive evangelical religious subculture and would go on to form the nuclei of the Reformed churches. Major part, statistical proof for the existence of 1,000 evangelical clerics in France. The ambition to calculate an estimate of the depth of the evangelical movement within the French clergy has its roots in a longitudinal study of the course of the Reformation in 4 cities and their surrounding areas: Amiens, Rouen, Bourges, and Poitiers. One of my key findings from investigating Bourges is that a series of 23 evangelically inclined clerics ministered to the faithful. At least 17 of them preached there. Some of them were only guest preachers during Advent or Lent. Over half, like the Benedictine Jean-Michel or the Augustinian friars Jean de Launay, Jean Loquet, and Augustin Malroba, had long public careers at Bourges. 14 of them who lived to the era of church formation eventually joined the Reformed. 9 of them became ministers. I hypothesized that, as at Bourges, throughout France, evangelically inclined Catholic clerics were similarly active. To test the idea, I began culling the records and studies of heresy trials and theological censures to draw up lists of suspect clerics, their deeds, and their beliefs. The corpus of relevant printed and archival sources, however, is vast, and tabulating them from all of them is simply not feasible. Like COVID-19 epidemiologists, we need a statistical shortcut to give a reliable view to the whole phenomenon. To obtain a statistical estimate warranting a high degree of certainty, we need solid base data. That is, a global sample or set of samples for all of France that provides some sense of the extent of the phenomenon. Next, we need a second set of examples that reveal the miss rate of the first samples. That is, the rate at which the judicial sources we do possess likely missed positive cases of heterodoxy. With that miss rate, we can extrapolate the likely real numbers of heterodox clerics. To obtain our baseline samples of French evangelical clerics, we turn to the hard-won findings of William Monter, James Farge, Nathaniel Weiss, Raymond Menser, and Henry Patry, who have extracted data about heresy trials from the records of France's 9 high courts, the Parlement. Monter's study provides, from the extant records of all 9, a global picture of the number of people, lay or cleric, executed for heresy from 1521 to 60. Breaking out his statistics for clerics gives us the data in the right-hand column of Figure 1. By his count, some 50 members of the clergy were executed for heresy. The column next to it gives the figures for the total number of clerics known to have appeared before those tribunals on charges of heresy, whatever the outcome, some 473. This data is not unproblematic. First, my tabulations for Rouen, which derive chiefly from ecclesiastical records, is incomplete. Second, as you will readily see, for the 5 smaller jurisdictions at the bottom of the list, we have no data about the number of heresy cases involving clerics. Third, as all scholars cited above note, their figures are incomplete because of gaps in the parliamentary records. To help correct for the latter problem, Figure 2 gives Monter's calculation of the survival rate of parliamentary records for the most intense period of heresy hunting from 1540 to 1560. Using those survival rates, we can, as in Figure 3, extrapolate what the full tally would be if we were to have all the records. The result of that tabulation suggests that 769 clerics were likely investigated for heresy in France's sovereign courts, and 81 of them executed. These are low, very conservative estimates based on extrapolation from known cases. But how many heterodox clerics did defenders of orthodoxy miss, or rather, at what rate? This is where my local studies come in. For 5 cities, I have tabulated lists of clerics hailing from those locales for whom there is clear evidence of heterodoxy. Further, as mentioned above concerning Bourges, I have noted those who were indicted or investigated by church or royal authorities, as well as the numbers known to have been executed for heresy. From this data, we can derive 2 miss rates. First is the rate at which heterodox clerics escaped detection. The second is the rate at which they paid the ultimate price for their beliefs, or rather the inverse, they escaped it, in this case over 90-some%. Second is, so averaging the figures for all 5 cities gives the rates calculated in the line second from bottom. Because the findings for Rouen and Bourges are more complete and derived from a stronger source base, they are more reliable and will be used to model up from the baseline parliamentary data. The tables in figure 5 use the miss rates just described to extrapolate from the baseline data from the parliamentary records in figures 1 and 3 to project the total number of evangelical clerics who operated in France from 1521 to 60. Table 5a indicates that the 50 known or 50 or 81 projected clerics executed for heresy represent only the tip of a sizable iceberg of clerical heterodoxy. If those executed only represent 2.8% of that mass, then there must have been some 1,800 to 2,900 heterodox clerics in total. Those figures are not a priori improbable. Indeed, be it the records of the current COVID-19 pandemic or those for heresy persecution, deaths or executions are far less likely either to go unrecorded by officials or unnoted by researchers than positive cases. Thus, further research is more likely to push down the 21% execution rate rather than up, meaning that the number of total clerics by that multiplier would, or that divisor would go up. Compared with the figures in table 5b, however, some 1,800 to 2,900 would seem an elevated estimate. If per the second rate, that is, those indicted only represent some 60% of the total, then the number of heterodox clerics would appear to be much more modest. Several caveats apply here. A great many of those I tagged in my city studies as having been investigated or indicted appear in ecclesiastical or municipal records, but not in an extant parliamentary record, which for Rouen, admittedly, are lacunary. Still, for the same reasons related above, we can let the 60% stand as a very conservative rate of correction, which could be revised downward, and again, the total number is up. An additional caveat is that the lower estimate of 788 is clearly far too low, for it is based only on the incomplete records of known cases from the lacunary parliamentary records. The second tally, the 1,200 heterodox clerics, that is in round terms the 1,000 of this paper's title, is better warranted and must be the absolute minimum number of evangelical clerics operating in France before 1560. The maximum could be 3 times higher. Conclusion: evangelical preaching and conventicle formation. The serial sources evoked above contain hundreds of trial summaries and ecclesiastical censures. Though frequently quite summary, these entries are extremely rich sources which could be exploited systematically. My as yet incomplete survey of them indicates that a sizable fraction of those 1,000 plus evangelical clerics preached and taught their heterodox doctrines to masses of people. These preachers were rarely schismatic and almost never rebellious. Repression did silence some. In response to persecution, scores of other clerics muffled or masked their voices for long periods, but kept on reappearing in these sources, some for up to over 3 decades. More importantly, the case records reveal that those who did proselytize had massive and enduring impact. They helped to seed and to sustain the conventicles whose existence authorities repeatedly fretted about from the mid-1520s onward. For merely the period up to 1547, James Farge has noted 74 cases where the Parliament of Paris pursued or warned about heretical conventicles. Judicial records reveal that authorities frequently sought clerics in company with handfuls, sometimes scores, of clerical and lay fellow travelers, a significant fraction of which included women of all social stations, including female nobles and notables, and even nuns. To give a few examples, at Rouen and in Normandy, such groups were investigated in 1529, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, and so on, all the way into 1561. So too, religious houses became foyers of heresy, most notably in the 1540s, when in 1545, 16 Benedictine nuns were in flight, some of them to Calvin's Geneva, heading to Calvin's Geneva, and in 1549, when 32 Augustinian friars suspected of heresy similarly were on the run. For Amiens, the surrounding region, in 1530 came a complaint about a slew of local clerics and noble men and women who variously opined that the recently executed Louis de Berquin was a martyr to the true faith. They attacked the cult of the saints and the penitential system, and they tried to convert some, or at least some of them, tried to convert some Franciscan sisters that would be better to marry and to earn their keep than to maintain their vows and beg. In the mid-1540s, a conventicle of some 70 laypersons was investigated at Amiens. They were interrogated whether they had heard the heretical sermons preached there in 1533 by the doctor of theology, Jean Morin. Some indeed had. 20 years later, the names of members of that same group appeared on the list of Huguenots drawn up by authorities during the First War of Religion. The goal of my ongoing work is to elevate such anecdotes, which can be multiplied many-fold, to the level of exemplars, of patterns and trends in the development of the evangelical movement, and its varied progression over time and space. With respect to the movement's relationship to the coming of the wars of religion in France, this ongoing research is gradually strengthening the case for a major hypothesis, namely that for 40 years, such heterodox clerics were both responsible for spreading the evangelical movement, as well as for containing it within the established church. They nourished an alternative religious subculture, which focused first on inculcating true doctrines of salvation, Bible reading, and catechesis, and only secondarily on criticizing the established ecclesiastical order and the church's customary religious rites. Almost never did such clerics challenge the established political order. The transformation of this evangelical religious minority into a schismatic and potentially revolutionary force required the leaven of Calvinist doctrinal and ecclesiological absolutism and an unforeseen season of political turmoil starting in 1559, one not dissimilar to the one we are living through now. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to comment and questions during the conference or as long as this recording or I live on. Merci.